Very good. So welcome. Welcome everyone to the ASILE, the first ASILE project annual conference. I'm so happy and grateful for this opportunity, such a special occasion for us, for the ASILE Consortium, to present the first preliminary research findings. And I would like to welcome all of you, wherever you are around the world. We have people connecting from different countries, regions. You are almost welcome in completely different time scales. So here we are together, and it's really quite wonderful to have this opportunity to link thanks to technology. So ASILE is a research project funded by the Horizon 2020 program of the European Commission. And the word ASILE brings us back to the core of this project. The word meaning protection, refuge for anyone looking for international protection. And the project studies the interactions between emerging and consolidated international protection systems and the United Nations Global Compact on refugees. We pay specific attention to the characteristics and the impacts of instruments, policy, and legal, regional, and country-specific instruments, and the actors that implement those instruments, and their compatibility with international human rights and refugee law. Now, our concept of solidarity is very much embedded into these human rights and refugee protection bedrock, which we can find in international and regional standards. So it's a concept of solidarity paying particular attention to individuals. Now, as you may notice, this is a different kind of understanding of solidarity that we most often see, where it's more of an interstate solidarity understanding, sidelining the actual people who are at the heart of those arrangements. When it comes to the European Union, of course, we talk about the right to seek asylum, which is enshrined in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. So the ASILE project takes this as a very clear point of departure. So it's been 1 year of work, even a little bit more, in a difficult context, of course, COVID-19 pandemic, and policies around the world adopted in the name of COVID-19, which have, let's say, restricted even more human mobility. They've very much focused on closure of borders and international travel. And we know that these policies have affected disproportionately and unfairly people in search of international protection, and people who do not have a voice. And this, if anything, COVID-19 has been a magnifying glass of already or previously existing policies focused on containment and restrictions of human mobility. Now, the project looks at those policies through the lens of both containment and mobility. So in the sense of containment, the focus being on non-admission, non-arrival, deterrence, remote control. We are witnessing pushbacks, hot returns at borders, in clear violation of human rights and the rule of law. So the project pays attention to those instruments and practices, but also mobility, meaning instruments that have been there for some time already, like resettlement, but also humanitarian admission programs, community sponsorships, and so forth, often labeled as complementary legal pathways. So we look at the intersections between these, containment and mobility concepts as they are reflected in these instruments and actors, looking at both their inclusionary and exclusionary components and dynamics from the perspective of international protection. So what we are already noticing is that usually it's not a one-sided story. Usually it's more about constrained mobility, not so much about containment, meaning full closure, but actually mobility is going on, but under highly restrictive patterns and manifestations, and even instruments that are presented as legal pathways, they come along with highly selective and often discriminatory components and features. Now, the project takes, as I was saying before, particular focus on the impact on individuals. So the impact of both instruments and actors on individuals. And here we are taking a critical approach to notions such as self-reliance or vulnerability, both part of the Global Compact on refugees, through also questioning the role of policies in co-creating structurally those very same vulnerabilities, limiting refugees' agency as well, and negatively often affecting the right to work under just and fair conditions. And also questions of gender and sexual orientation. What about those very fundamental questions in terms of agency by people? And the last component is because of our notion of solidarity. The notion of solidarity that we use is so clearly embedded in international and regional human rights and refugee law, meaning here states do not have flexibility to pick and choose. Governments do not have a choice. They must comply with those standards. We look at models of responsibility attribution and also accountability. Legal accountability, but also political accountability and financial accountability. You know, the Global Compact in itself is not a legally binding instrument. Still, it draws very clear political accountabilities, both internally and externally, for the signatory parties. Similarly, one can say the same thing for the Global Compact on migration. So we explore those models in cases where states do not fulfill their duties in human rights and refugee law. Now, the project has a clear global approach with intention of being non-EU centric, meaning that we draw from comparisons in different countries and regions. And we have designed those comparisons in two thematic streams, which are also reflected in the program of today and tomorrow. The first thematic stream pays attention to instruments in countries like Brazil, Bangladesh, Canada, Jordan, South Africa, and Turkey. So we look at instruments presented in the shapes of legal pathways or complementary pathways, or focused on labor market participation. And again, looking at them from their inclusionary and exclusionary components. How do they relate to the logics of containment and mobility? I'm very happy to announce that we have now in the ASILE website that I invite you to visit, the 6 country fiches covering those countries, providing an in-depth examination, extremely high quality overview of the key issues, policies, and statistics when it comes to the policies in those countries. And we will examine this in panel 1 of this afternoon. I'm very glad to welcome all the speakers and the discussants who are here with us, again, from different countries and regions in the world. And the second thematic component is EU third country cooperation arrangements and agreements, including financial instruments. Here, the project pays particular attention to not only countries like Turkey and Jordan, but also others like Serbia, Tunisia, and Niger, so as to examine the same thing. You know, what about the inclusionary and exclusionary components of those arrangements? What are the questions that they pose from the perspective of accountability and attribution of responsibilities? All very important questions in light of the new EU Pact. Of course, I had to mention this. The EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, the so-called Pact, that we've argued that is not a pact, in fact. So we are, of course, paying attention how that so-called pact puts as one of their priorities cooperation with third countries. You know, the externalized, so-called externalization agenda, and between brackets, migration partnerships. So here also we have a new ASILE paper published mapping the key instruments and really looking at the academic literature, main debates in the literature on this. And we'll have panel 2 tomorrow, tomorrow afternoon, on arrangements with third countries. Now, hopefully we will gather some lessons learned or not to be learned, practices not to be learned for the EU when thinking about EU policies on migration, asylum, and borders. So this is one of the also components and goals of today's meeting. And just before kicking off with the first panel, I just, of course, wanted to thank, the CEPS team, Miriam Mir, who is project coordinator at CEPS, and thanks to her, also we are here today and tomorrow. Big thanks, Miriam, for constant support and contribution in the ASILE project and at CEPS, and also the CEPS team. Some of you are already one here, Lina Bosirlute, research fellow, who is chairing this panel today, and Roberto Cortinovis, who will be chairing tomorrow's panel on third country arrangements, and Jun Luke, who you don't see, he's actually making possible all the technical arrangements, so really thanks, Jun. And our appreciation as CEPS to all the ASILE partners, the 12 universities, civil society partner, Danish Refugee Council, and UNHCR for their cooperation and partnership, and our 2 associated partners, as well in Canada and in Brazil. So this is it by me. I very much look forward to the conversations and the presentations, and I hope all of you will enjoy this occasion. And I now give the floor immediately to Lina. Lina, up to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending where are you finding yourselves. Today, indeed, we'll have an amazing road trip around the world. Borders are closed. However, we will take you from Canada to Brazil to Jordan and South Africa. You also will have a possibility to see a nice Aarhus University courtyard. So bear with us. We'll have 2 exciting hours. And just before kicking off with the presentations, we would like to tell you that speakers will have 10 minutes to present the arguments. And our speakers are Audrey McLean from University of Toronto, Natalia Medina from Federal University of Bahia, Fatima Khan from Refugee Rights Unit at University of Cape Town, and also Louis Turner from Newcastle University. Then our speakers will be followed by discussants responding or interacting to the points raised, and they will have 7 minutes to react. So we very much welcome Tamiras Fakouri from Aalborg University and Sciences Po, Luisa Feline Freire from Universidad del Pacífico, joining from Peru, Adela Garnier from University of Laval, joining from Quebec, and Jens Vested Hansen from Aarhus University. So we are also asking all of our attendees who are joining via Zoom to react, and you can pose your questions using Q&A function. Also, we invite all of you to interact and join the conversation or discussion happening parallelly online. So you can use Twitter, #AsileForum, #Global Solidarity, and you can also follow ASILE project handle. So after just having this rules of the house set, let's begin with the exciting country presentations. And the first one, I will invite Audrey McLean from University of Toronto to briefly outline also starting this discussion about national asylum governance instruments on mobility and containment perspective. As Sergio has outlined, while some of them are portrayed often as best or good practices, they might be at best promising, however, also entail some disadvantages or risks, especially in terms of protection. So Audrey McLean has elaborated a lot on private sponsorship aspect, and since Canada has been praised for going in that direction, and actually the global sponsorship scheme in Global Compact on Refugees has been very much designed on this basis. So Audrey, could you give your overview in 10 minutes and just highlight what are the pros and cons and challenges that you see? And we very much invite you all, everyone, also to read Audrey's contribution on the country fish on this subject. Please unmute yourself, Audrey.
Hi. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it is a real pleasure and an honor to be among all of you. I am happy to talk about refugee resettlement to Canada, and with a focus on private sponsorship. It happens to be the subject of my a current empirical research project. And there are many good things to say about it, but I am going to use my 10 minutes to, if I may, inject some cautionary notes into the idea of refugee resettlement, particularly private sponsorship, as a concept that can be, as it were, exported in a plug-and-play mode. And so just to explain a little bit about refugee resettlement, I think that everybody knows that it is one of the 3 durable solutions promoted by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee Law. It is for refugees. It's important to recognize, I think, that the 3 durable solutions, return, local integration, and resettlement, don't seem to obviously include what is actually the major preoccupation, certainly of countries of the global north, which is asylum seeking in the way we understand it. And it's significant, I think, that asylum fits quite ambiguously into the 3 durable solutions. You have to work hard to fit it in. And I'll return to that as part of my cautionary story. As a mode of resettlement, as a mode of resolving the intractable challenges faced by refugees, I also want to emphasize that less than 0.5% of the world's refugees will ever be resettled. And even countries that engage in it at a higher rate relative to other countries of the world, I have to tell you, resettle a number of refugees that is trivial by comparison to the number of refugees hosted in the global south. The numbers are, for lack of a better description, a rounding error in comparison to the over 85% of refugees hosted in the global south. So I think a bit of humility about resettlement is in order here. Canada has, as you noted, a public model where the government sponsors refugees and essentially pays the full cost, as well as a parallel private model in which private citizens come together, form groups, and do both the financial assistance for 1 year, as well as some of the heavy lifting of resettlement. And here I'll just inject a note about how the work done by private citizens in this group is actually an important and interesting site for thinking about solidarity, both because of the actions themselves, but also because of the potential politicizing effect that actually working directly with refugees can have on so-called ordinary citizens. Now, in Canada, resettlement is not formally presented by the government or by dominant political parties as a potential replacement for asylum. Okay, so it's not as if this is used as an argument to say, hey, we resettle, we don't need to have an asylum system anymore. But there are always subcurrents that will try to do that, particularly conservative political actors. The private model of resettlement is not presented as in competition with or as a substitute for a public model of resettlement. And again, this is significant, and this is insisted upon most strongly by those who actually do private sponsorship. Okay, but this is all a fragile state of affairs. Next, I want to make a point shifting into the relationship between resettlement, mobility, and containment. that resettlement as practiced by Canada or any other country, in some sense, is not about mobility in its most meaningful sense. It's not actually about advancing what I understand mobility to signify, which is agentic or autonomous movement by people. It's about people being moved under the control of the government that is doing resettlement. And in that sense, it is, of course, highly constrained. So how does this relate then to the containment prong of the ASILE project? And so while resettlement and private sponsorship seems like this happy story, I want to suggest to you that it also links to narratives of containment, and that's where the cautionary note comes in. So first, I want to emphasize that unlike asylum seeking, or asylum or non-refoulement more precisely, resettlement is an act of discretion. There is absolutely no legal obligation on any state to do it. So states voluntarily undertake to resettle, and in so doing, they are in effect showing sovereignty in its most flattering light. States insist upon and exercise their sovereign discretion to admit and accept people out of a humanitarian commitment, but they do so not under legal obligation, but as a gesture, as it were, of humanitarianism. And that means that states are still in control. They're still doing the choosing. And that aligns perfectly, of course, with a vision of sovereignty that, if you will, fetishizes border control. A state is sovereign to the extent that it controls its borders. Resettlement does not disturb that narrative. States view, I think incorrectly, but they view asylum seeking as challenging sovereignty. Resettlement does not. So another note to consider here is, I've said as a contingent fact, asylum is not, resettlement is not portrayed as a substitute for asylum in Canada. But one can easily imagine how states that are particularly unhappy about or resistant to asylum seeking might well appear to embrace resettlement as an alternative to asylum. And the narrative would go something like this. All of the good and deserving refugees are lying abjectly in refugee camps abroad, waiting patiently to be selected by countries for resettlement. Those are the good and deserving refugees. Those who demonstrate agency and initiative and clamber onto leaky boats or on the back of trucks or get smugglers to help them get documents to fly in, those are the bad refugees. And so we as a state will assist the good refugees who wait for us to choose them, and this gives us additional justification for obstructing, barring, deflecting, and deterring the so-called bad refugees who use their own initiative to seek asylum. I think that's a narrative that one should be quite concerned about in any export initiative regarding resettlement. With respect to private sponsorship or community sponsorship, here the cautionary note is as follows. It is the case that in Canada, the government has a commitment to sponsor refugees. And they do so in roughly equal numbers to those who are privately sponsored. Those then who engage in private sponsorship know that they are being accompanied, as it were, by a public commitment to resettlement. If one tried to implant or export a model of private or community sponsorship to a country that doesn't have a robust practice of public resettlement, then I think one predictably or understandably might encounter resistance that says, why should we as private actors do what is quintessentially public work on behalf of the government? That is to say, the phenomenon of receiving, incorporating, integrating newcomers to the country is quintessentially public. Why would we as private actors, why should we take on this responsibility that the government appears to be offloading onto us as somehow an act of charity or private responsibility? So I think if you don't have a background condition of a demonstrated public commitment to resettlement, I wonder about the take-up of any kind of model of private sponsorship. The last point I'll make as a cautionary note is, recall that earlier I said asylum seeking fits uncomfortably into the three models of durable solutions, even though it is the dominant practice that obsesses governments of the global north. Now, if you think about some of the more recent policy initiatives about how, in effect, to deter, prevent, deflect, and otherwise bar asylum seekers from the global north, many of them involve what I'd call extraterritorial initiatives, somehow imposing on third countries or some kind of location outside of the territory of the country the responsibility to determine asylum claims, after which the state that is orchestrating this may or may not admit some of those who are determined to be refugees. I want to caution about this initiative and point out what I think it's really doing. What it's really doing is, by stealth, attempting to replace an asylum system with a resettlement system. Because once those people are processed overseas in some undisclosed location, then and only then will the first country decide whether to admit any of those successful, so-called successful refugees. Well, we're in the land of resettlement then, and we know resettlement is discretionary. It is not obligatory. And we have seen from even the short-term experience of European states making resettlement undertakings amongst themselves, how those undertakings tend to be eroded over time and not fulfilled. So I just want to end with a warning about these new innovations to externalize, extraterritorialize asylum seeking, and to understand that what they are, in my view, is an attempt to replace asylum by stealth with resettlement, and resettlement is not underwritten by any legal obligation, and that would indeed spell, in my view, the end of meaningful refugee protection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And I would also like to quote something from your country fish that you also wrote, that with this private, especially sponsorship model, countries are attempting to privatize what should be a public responsibility to resettle refugees, and thereby replacing a public commitment with a private charity. That's another very important note of caution you have raised in your paper, and thank you for giving this in-depth analysis and contextualizing it, since it's so important not to see those models as fitting into any kind of context, as it's sometimes misassumed, and ASILE is doing its best to try to place or look into those factors, where and which models could work, and what are the risks. So thank you so much. And if you have questions for Audrey or any other discussant, you can use Q&A function. And now we will move to Brazil, actually. So we will very much welcome Natalia Medina from Federal University of Bahia to elaborate also on kind of interesting phenomenon, Operation Welcome, that has been started in Brazil, also as one of those humanitarian corridors or initiatives to facilitate refugee arrivals in a more humane manner. However, as interesting or promising as it looks, it has also certain drawbacks or implications. So, dear Natalia, the 10 minutes are yours, and we would like to hear more about Operation Welcome and other interesting practices and labor market arrangements in Brazil, since they are seen also as exemplary outside. But what are the views from the inside and the situation you are witnessing? Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you to all. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. First, I would like to thank the ASILE project team in the person of Professor Sergio Carrera. It is an honor to participate in this annual conference, sharing this virtual space with scholars from around the world. I greet everyone, and It's a challenge to talk after Professor Audrey. She has made such a great presentation about Canada, and I'm looking forward to hear about the other countries too. I also extend my greetings to everyone who attends the event. On my presentation today, I'm going to go through some points about Brazilian national asylum system, focusing on the most recent developments and especially on the so-called Operation Welcome. So Brazil is a party to the main refugee protection instruments, and at the domestic levels, refugee protection came in 1997. The refugee definition that the law brings is broader than the 1951 Convention and its protocol. It includes a definition, in the definition, any person who, due to a serious and widespread violation of human rights, is forced to leave his country of nationality to seek refuge in another country. And this broader definition partially incorporates the expanded definition provided for in the 1984 Cartagena Declaration. Yeah, it is an inclusionary device in the ASILE perspective, but as we will see, there has been some resistance in applying it. Also in 2017, we had a new migration law. It overcame a law from the military dictatorship that saw immigrants as a matter of national security. And this 2017 migration law completed the framework, and established a paradigm for protecting the human rights of immigrants. Although its restrictive regulation has also raised debates about setbacks and limited scopes, there is quite a tension about progressive legislation, and it has been impossible to fully put it in practice, these inclusionary instruments. So even though Brazil has been a country populated by migrants since colonization, in contemporary times, immigrants have represented a small fraction of the population. And on the other hand, recent flows have tested the country's ability to respond adequately to the needs brought by these flows, especially those related to arrival of immigrants and refugees from the global south since the beginning of the 21st century, and especially in the last 10 years. As of 2010, there was a significant influx of Haitians, and from 2015, in greater numbers, Venezuelans. So these are like the so-called mixed flows and forced migration flows. Then they have put pressure on the refugee system and entail new framings. So the arrival of Haitian nationals after 2010 earthquake fostered intense debates about their status, and the National Committee for Refugees decided they were not refugees but should be protected, and therefore they sent all cases to the National Immigration Council, which ended up forging an ad hoc solution, the so-called humanitarian visa. And such a solution was later incorporated in the new migration law of 2017. And this instrument has been criticized for emptying the institute of refuge, especially considering the Brazilian expanded definition of refugee. Besides, it does not have the same guarantees as the refugee status has. New developments have also come from the arrival of Venezuelans, especially from 2015 on. Asylum seeker application remained a pending decision for a long time, and meanwhile, Brazil adopted another ad hoc solution with a resolution from, again, the National Immigration Council in March 2017. And this is inspired in the Mercosur residence agreement. The settlement under the terms of the resolution is made through temporary resident status for 2 years and can then be converted in permanent residence if the solicitant meets some criteria, especially proof of subsistence conditions in the country. And to apply for that, they have to withdraw the asylum seeker application. So while these resident legal status were solved, Brazil was still managing the situational realities at the borders, which had become an issue with the escalation of people entering via the northern region of the country. This region of arrival is Roraima, which shares a border with Venezuela, and it's poorly connected to the rest of the country. And in 2017, the inability to provide adequate responses locally became evident. And faced with this scenario, several non-governmental actors and international organizations began mobilizing to assist Venezuelans. In February 2018, the federal government initiated a more substantial role in the governance of this migratory call, and that was the so-called Operation Welcome, Operação Acolhida in Portuguese. There is a Federal Emergency Assistance Committee, that is the deliberative body responsible for establishing emergency assistance guidelines and actions under the coordination of the Civil House. Several ministries such as Defense, Economy, Regional Development, Justice, Education, Health, Women, and so on are involved in the actions of the operation. And it also has as partners the United Nations, civil society, religious institutions, private initiatives, states, municipalities. So it's a very complex organizational structure, but it is clear that the Ministry of Defense is the main subject of articulation, since the Army oversees its operational coordination, comprising the Humanitarian Logistics Task Force. Hence, there is this strong military character of the operation. And the normative structuring was made by a provisional measure, which then was converted into a law with some changes. And the operation is structured in 3 stages, which is border ordering, reception, and interiorization. The first one includes the documentation, vaccination, control operations made by Brazilian Army and partners. More than 260,000 people, Venezuelans, have already requested migratory regularization at this point, whether requesting for temporary residence or applying for asylum. Second, the reception stage encompasses offering shelter, food, health care, among other routine activities. And shelters can be overseen by municipal authorities, civil society, multiple actors. The Ministry of Citizenship and UNHCR are responsible for coordinating the reception and assistance, and the armed forces for logistics, security, health. Finally, the third stage is what we call interiorization, which means voluntary displacement of Venezuelans from Roraima to other units of the Federation with the objective of socioeconomic inclusion. As of February 2021, recently, so around 48,000 Venezuelans have been interiorized by this program. The operation provides transportation and integration assistance in other states of Brazil. Only those documented, immunized, clinically evaluated can benefit from it. And there are different types of internalization, such as family reunion, or even leaving shelters in Roraima to other shelters in the destination city, or referred with a job offer in view. It is not difficult to grasp in Operation Welcome the tensions arising between containment and mobility, or between care and control. Inclusionary and exclusionary components are profoundly connected. The concept of humanitarian infrastructure helps us understand this ambiguous character as part of a larger effort to maintain border control and extend humanitarian assistance to refugees and migrants. The control of mobility is empowered by the fact that many Venezuelans are trapped in the region of entry in Roraima. And in order to be interiorized, they must go through triage and their data must be processed. So some scholars, such as Mulan and Pallister Wilkins, have noted the role of shelters in controlling and disciplining migrants by interrupting mobility and collecting data. Restrictions on the freedom to come and go and the setting of rigid routines are a relevant part of the operation, even though the humanitarian aspect is usually the most emphasized. So it is important to realize that the 3 stages of the operation are interconnected and complementary. They are linked to the objective of rendering a crisis solution more knowable and controllable. The interiorization program, for instance, changes the timing and the direction of mobility inside Brazilian borders. And border ordering, along with the recognition of refugee status or that of a resident, impacts the fluidity of movement of those who live in the borders and live on the move, like some members of some ethnic groups, like the Warao and Nyepa groups. Yeah. So I'm just closing up. Finally, I would like to mention that the National Committee for Refugees in June 2019 recognized that Venezuelan citizens were also refugees, applying the expanded definition provided for in the 1997 law for the first time. But this protection system has been once again challenged by COVID-19 pandemic, since the borders of Brazil, between Brazil and Venezuela by land, are officially closed since the beginning of the pandemic. So I think that that's it. I look forward to hear your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Natalia, and for also highlighting these tensions, how on the one hand, regularization can mean less of kind of asylum type of protection in the Brazil, and this tension is also a bit resonating to what also Audrey McLean has highlighted in Canadian case. And interestingly, that also Operation Welcome has been set up as trust fund, and in the European Union now we have a big trend of setting up various trust funds to solve different issues. So maybe we will come back to that in the discussion, and also that this type of temporary humanitarian protection approaches that again we have in the new pact, new EU Asylum and Migration Pact. We have also this focus on crisis situations, and here it nicely links to the next intervention on South Africa, because just or similarly to Brazil, similar regularization or dispensation measures have been started in South Africa as to kind of regularize Zimbabwean and other migrants, but a bit in a different way, kind of mixing economic and refugee type of protection mechanisms. So we would like to invite Fatima Khan from University of Cape Town to elaborate on South African approach, because this is yet another example of so-called promising practice, and we would like to hear also your cautionary remarks. So Fatima,
thank you.
Yeah, and
thank you, Lina, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm happy to be here and really consider it an honor. I would like to say to my previous speakers, Audrey and Natalie, you've set a very high standard. I hope to follow suit. I'm going to share one slide with you. Thank you. It doesn't seem to have. All right, let me start anyway. For today's presentation on South Africa, I'm going to focus on a specific policy instrument, the Zimbabwean Dispensation Program, to understand whether this ZDP is a form of refugee and migrant containment, a form of mobility, or whether it is a form of contained mobility. I believe we must understand the logic or the rationale behind its adoption. Was there a humanitarian logic behind its adoption? Did South Africa intend to provide a complementary pathway to protection, or was this ZDP covertly used by South Africa to restrict refugee and or migrant mobility? But first, why Zimbabwe and what is the ZDP? In 2008, there was a political situation in Zimbabwe due to a disputed election. Many Zimbabweans were uprooted, lost their livelihoods, and as a result, they migrated to South Africa to seek economic recourse. Due to our immigration legislation, the difficulties in applying for work through our immigration legislation, many turned to the asylum system to regularize their stay. This has consistently been the narrative of the South African government. Zimbabweans are here in South Africa for not for asylum, but for economic relief. At the time, the UNHCR noted that South Africa had the highest number of asylum seekers in the world. This exceeded what the South African government could deal with at the asylum level. South Africa further claimed an inability to determine claims for political persecution from Zimbabwe. To this can be added the fact that Zimbabwe and South Africa enjoy cordial relations. They share a long history of cross-border migration, and these countries are bonded in the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. So to deal with this situation, South Africa initially resorted to large-scale deportations, and it raised the ire of human rights activists. It cost South Africa billions of rands. It harmed South Africa's image as a human rights country in the SADC region and in Africa, and it potentially upset a neighboring country. So South Africa needed a plan. It decided on a special response to the Zimbabwean migrants in South Africa. So just 1 year before the ZDP, South Africa did make a concession. It allowed Zimbabweans to live and work in South Africa for 3 months at a time. This was accompanied by a moratorium on deportations and a removal of visa requirements for Zimbabweans. But the government deemed it necessary to abandon that 2009 ministerial exemption. And this policy of allowing all or any Zimbabwean free entry into South Africa and the right to work, even though it was just for short periods, for 3 months at a time, it was clearly unsustainable. And it did lead to increased xenophobia. And in September 2010, the South African government announced ZDP. So the objectives of the ZDP were, number one, to regularize large numbers of undocumented Zimbabweans, reduce pressure on the asylum and refugee system, and provide amnesty to Zimbabweans who had obtained fraudulent South African documents. In the short term, the ZDP offered an alternative to a clogged asylum system, and under the new system, work, study, and business permits were granted to Zimbabwean migrants who were already employed, schooling, or running businesses in South Africa. To qualify for this, these migrants had to be domiciled in South Africa, had to provide a host of documentation, Zimbabwean passport, proof of employment, proof of academic registration at an academic institution, or proof of entrepreneurship, and all these things were very difficult to obtain for refugees. In the end, 294,511 applications were made within a period of 3 months. Of these, 49,255 were of individuals who gave up their asylum claims. This meant that there was still about 1 million Zimbabweans in South Africa who perhaps did not meet or did not apply for the ZDP, may still have been in the asylum system, or were undocumented in South Africa. But what the ZDP then created was a legitimate avenue for deportation of undocumented Zimbabweans. So is the introduction of the ZDP a case of refugee law becoming immigration law? When we answer this question, comparisons can easily be drawn with Europe in the 1990s. I remember reading an article by Lenikov where he identified the restrictive move in asylum policy of prioritizing state controls over admissions, and he underlined a source control bias aimed at removing so-called root causes of refugee mobility. South Africa followed a similar path. It had for the longest time opted for what it called a policy of quiet diplomacy with our neighboring country, Zimbabwe. It refused to acknowledge that there was political turmoil in Zimbabwe, and the very high percentage, 99.6% of rejection of asylum applications is clearly evidence of this. So it was clear that South Africa's approach to Zimbabwe was one of protection of borders rather than persons, and as stated by Leniko, when this happens, when we prioritize borders over persons, then refugee clearly become immigration law. So was there a humanitarian logic behind the ZTP? We could look at South African refugee law and look at where the South African refugee law provided the South African government with an option for humanitarian approach. Is our Refugees Act humanitarian in nature? It's my understanding that the notion of humanitarian admission is usually designed to provide an expedited and a time-efficient asylum processing and providing temporary protection to refugees. And I remember in 2008 and 2009, many scholars and human rights activists proposed the issuing of humanitarian visas for Zimbabwe. And in my opinion, this could have been facilitated through the Refugees Act. But for this to happen, South Africa would have had to acknowledge that there was a serious disturbance of the public order in Zimbabwe and that Zimbabwean lives were at risk. Such an acknowledgement would have satisfied the expanded definition of refugee in South African law. Furthermore, the Refugees Act also provides a way to deal with a mass inflow of refugees. The minister may, if he or she considers any group or any category of persons to qualify for refugee status, declare such a group to be refugees, either conditionally or unconditionally. South Africa did not do this. South Africa instead opted to use the Immigration Act, and in doing so, in my opinion, it exposed its approach. The Immigration Act is about migration management and control, unlike our Refugees Act, which is about protection and which is clearly human rights sensitive. So did South Africa intend for the ZDP to be a complementary pathway to protection for Zimbabweans? When we look at the UNHCR how UNHCR distinguishes refugee-specific complementary pathways and non-refugee specific complementary pathways based on existing migration avenues, which may include family reunification, labor, education, then it's clear that the ZDP was not meant to be a refugee-specific complementary pathway. If South Africa, so we have to look at whether South Africa made flexible use of the immigration policy tools such as work and study, as envisaged by the DCR. But in my opinion, they did not do that. South Africa did not turn to those sections of the Immigration Act to provide a pathway. Instead, it turned to another section granting the minister a discretion of allowing Zimbabweans into South Africa. So was the ZDP of benefit to Zimbabwean asylum seekers? Perhaps in the short run, because it provided a faster and a quicker access to becoming lawful in South Africa. But in the long run, it did not do this. It was nothing, it took away benefits from refugees in the long run. The ZDP is temporary in nature, even though it has been extended 3 times and will expire now in December 2021. Had these applicants remained in the asylum system, there would have been a pathway to naturalization for them. But with the ZDP, they remain temporary. So the ZDP is also not protection sensitive at all. There was nothing in the ZDP that made any reference to the abandoned claims. So for example, what would happen at the expiration of the ZDP? Can Zimbabweans apply for refugee status, or will they just be deported? It kind of reminds me of Costello Wenchi, of how migration control practices can suppress refugee mobility, and bear down particularly heavily on refugees or would-be refugees in her assessment of the GCR and its nexus to the GCM. In my view, this bifurcation of refugee law and migration law into two separate processes in South Africa bear the same risk. So the ZDP has artificially relabeled asylum seekers in South Africa. I don't think I have time to debate the treatments. I'm going to answer a final question. Will this happen again in South Africa? Will we have another ZDP or other programs like this? Yes, we already have the Lesotho dispensation program, and there are talks of a Malawi and a Mozambique dispensation. And when we look at these bilateral or bilateral agreements, it has become even clearer now that South Africa set out to protect its borders rather than persons. To be noted, all these countries are neighboring countries. They are in the SADC region, where there is already a draft-free movement protocol in place. It has not been adopted by South Africa, but by South Africa signing these bilateral agreements, it has skillfully circumvented the free movement protocol, and it has developed its own form. So in conclusion, has the ZDP been beneficial? Or what do I think of the ZDP? I can quote Kenichi Serena, who said 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The ZDP was unlikely to ever do marginally more than affect the number of Zimbabweans applying for asylum. Most important is that 10 years later, Zimbabweans remain the highest number of asylum seekers in South Africa. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for elaborating on this issue and showing like what are the longer term consequences when framing someone as either migrant or refugees, and especially the risks of refoulement in a longer run. And I think bringing back to Europe, a similar discussion is about, you know, we have so many Ukrainian refugees or migrants, and it's not clear who they are in Poland because they are positioned as refugees in some instances and as migrants in others. And this is yet another example how protection mechanism increasingly moved into some sort of migration management scheme, where again the states don't have equivalent obligations under international law. And we are moving now to the Jordanian context with Louis Turner. And actually, Louis has also contributed to ASILE forum on especially on the questions of the labor market integration on Jordan. But we also would like to highlight that we have also excellent country fish on Jordan, and especially also elaborating on the so-called Jordan Compact that has been seen as yet another promising or interesting practice by European Union, since European Union also invested a lot to create economic zone and to deliver loans as to enable integration, but as a trade-off for non-arrival of those asylum seekers into the European territories. So Luis, 10 minutes is yours. And for the colleagues interested, you can also find Dr. Gerasimos Tsourapas from University of Birmingham in collaboration with Simon Verduin, Mixed Migration Center paper also for your attention. So Luis, you can unmute yourself, and we are looking forward to hear from you. So what are the long-term consequences of so-called Jordan Compact?
Great, thanks, Lena, and thanks everyone. It's really nice to be here. And thank you to all of the other speakers for their great presentations. I've learned a lot already this afternoon. So as Lena mentioned, I'm Lewis Turner from Newcastle University, and I've been asked to speak about the Jordan Compact and to think about the Jordan Compact today in this presentation through the lens of the key ASILE themes of containment and mobility. So I'll firstly briefly introduce the compact for those of you who might not know it or might not know the context, and then move on to thinking about it in terms of those mobility and containment ideas. So the Jordan Compact recently turned 5 years old. It came out in February 2016. So now is very much part of the landscape of the Syria refugee response in Jordan. But at the time that it came out, it was anything but part of the landscape and was very new and almost seen as a sort of revolutionary innovation in refugee work. It spoke indeed of a new paradigm for refugee responses. There were multiple elements to the compact, including on education and school access for Syrians in Jordan. But the area that I want to focus on is what might be thought of as the central part of the compact, which was the attempts to enable Syrian refugees in Jordan to access the formal labour market through allowing Syrians to obtain work permits, which in practice they had not been able to up until that point. The compact, so an agreement between Jordan and its donors, envisaged up to 200,000 Syrians being able to work in the coming years in the formal labour market in Jordan in exchange for additional donor support and preferential trade agreements between Jordan and the EU. The implementation of the compact has had its ups and downs, it's fair to say, and both its supporters and its critics. On the one hand, its supporters point to the fact that by now around 200,000 work permits have been issued to Syrian refugees over the past 5 years. Critics, on the other hand, point to the fact that while it was initially hoped that that would mean 200,000 Syrians working with work permits, that is a cumulative number. And so perhaps only around 40,000 Syrian refugees are working with work permits or hold work permits at any one time. Some point out that the Jordan Compact has enabled a massive focus and funding of development-related initiatives and livelihood schemes, and the sort of integration of humanitarian and development responses to displacement. Critics, on the other hand, point out that the funding shortfalls, despite any increases in the context of the compact, are still huge. Some argue that the formal labour market is providing better working conditions, better job security, and so forth, while critics, on the other hand, point out that Syrians themselves tend to say that their conditions at work haven't really changed in the past 5 years. What they point to is a decreased fear of deportation or criminal punishment for working informally, which is of course very important, but not the same necessarily as the kind of improvements in working conditions that people hoped for. But I want to take a step back from some of these debates, important as they are, and sort of have a look, as I said, at this instrument and this agreement of the Jordan Compact, like my fellow panelists, from the perspective of containment and mobility. Because as Lena mentioned in the introduction, while the Jordan Compact was understandably hailed as an important move forward in terms of refugee rights, it did essentially come as part of a bargain, or it constituted a bargain. Not only this bargain between Jordan and its donors in terms of funding and trade, but also an underlying bargain that there should be a trade-off, that the improvement in refugees' living conditions in Jordan, or the anticipated improvement in their living conditions in Jordan through being able to work, should lead to a reduction in the number of asylum seekers and refugees coming to Europe. Now, whether this logic is accurate is another question. In fact, there's a lot of reasons to think that that logic isn't accurate and that trade-off doesn't exist, at least in the way that policymakers imagine it. But that was certainly the intended idea. And the UK government, which was one of the key actors behind the compact at the time, was fairly explicit about that, in fact. So more rights for refugees, but more rights where they are now. At the same time, though, and less commented upon, are the questions of mobility and containment within Jordan, which have affected the implementation of the compact and its effects for Syrian refugees. Because while they're not typically framed this way, a lot of the challenges that the compact has had have been related to questions of mobility. So, for example, that concerns Syrians who live in Jordan's refugee camps, who didn't for quite some time were not able to get access to work permits, although this has since happened. But the mobility challenges didn't stop there. Many camp residents, particularly in Azraq camp in the Eastern Desert, live in very remote location, meaning that questions of transport and the cost of transport have prevented many in practice from being able to work. This has again been made much more difficult by the shutdowns and restrictions on movement during the pandemic. There are also gendered questions of mobility that are important to consider. A 2019 report by Qasem Al-Nuashi, for example, has detailed how both practically and culturally, men are able to, for example, spend a week away from their family in the camp in order to work in a city far away. But that's much more complex for women who do the overwhelming majority of childcare and domestic labour, and for whom it is considered much more culturally challenging to work far away from home, even for day shifts and to return every day to the camp. All of these factors, of course, come in addition to a range of other challenges, such as low wages and poor working conditions, and the sectors for which jobs are available for Syrians, which are often not the sectors that they wish to work in. But the questions of mobility within Jordan are not limited to camp residents, because indeed thinking of the instruments that we're looking at in Jordan and throughout this project, Jordanian work permits are themselves a fairly immobile instrument, at least in many sectors. And one of the things that the implementers of the Jordan Compact have had to try and do is to make work permits more mobile between sectors, between regions, between areas of the country, between jobs. Many work permits are tied to an employer. Many work permits are only for one whole year, which didn't reflect the nature of the working practices in the sectors in which Syrians worked the most. Nor typically did it reflect many Syrians' preferences for how they would like to work when in Jordan. Which brings us then to the broader question of formality and informality, which is one of the key themes that's coming out of the current research on refugee rights and working rights that we're doing in the ASILE project. Because one of the things that the Compact tries to do is to put a formal framework, to put a series of formal logics and regulations and legislation onto a context that is complex and typically very informal. More theoretically and more widely, it brings up an interesting and perhaps challenging question about the relationship between refugee rights and informality. Now, certainly informality comes with challenges, often comes with costs, can come with or lead to exploitation. But it's also worth considering whether there might be advantages of informality and for whom. Because often formal work is assumed to be better because formality is thought to be a proxy for other things that are or should be valued, like job security, like better conditions and rights at work. But the experience of the Jordan Compact shows that apart from secure legal status, the formality doesn't actually seem to bring those things that it's anticipated to bring. So to what extent can informality and ambiguity and flexibility be helpful, and to whom? Whose interests are in fact served by formalizing structures and relationships, and whose interests are harmed, and how can those trade-offs be judged and evaluated? And to what extent is it assumed that these sectors or swathes of life require regulation because regulation is what governments do and also in this instance, what humanitarians do and what NGOs do. And I think these are challenging questions and perhaps come up against a lot of people's intuitions, including my own, but I think it's important to explore them. And of course, finally, to conclude, to what extent or in what ways are refugees' lives enhanced and or harmed, and refugees' rights in practice enhanced or harmed by informal structures that might simply be beyond the capacity of governments and humanitarians to regulate. And I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Luis, for posing so many questions. We hope we'll have time to go back to them and to elaborate. And by the way, it seems in Newcastle you have such a nice weather behind you. It's such a blue sky. But thank you so much also for showing how many nuance there is, and bringing also bringing forward the highlight on gender and how different gender aspects or integration practices are in itself genderized, and what kind of outcomes does it have? Because indeed the ASILE project also puts a big emphasis on the gender dimension in our research. And with this, I would like to move now to the discussants, and each of them will have 7 minutes each, but we also encourage our attendees to pose questions in Q&A function for any of the panelists that you heard. And should you have any particular question, the panelists also can interact with you bilaterally. We would like now to hear 7 minutes of reflection from each of discussants. And first of them is Tamirase Fakhuri, as I mentioned, from Aalborg University and CNSPO. She also made a ASILE forum contribution elaborating on experiences in Lebanon. And we would like to hear from you whether it resonates, what we just heard, the experiences of containment and mobility, and how certain practices are shown as rights advancing, but in fact have some other aspects. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Lina. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a discussant in this fascinating panel and to be able to discuss those amazing contributions. So I will just speak very briefly about each contribution and perhaps ask some questions or try to kind of inspire some reflections at the end. So the contributions have critically looked at national governance instruments through the lens of mobility and containment, showing us how, in fact, such tools manufacture precarity. And this ties in very much to what Sergio said at the beginning, or framed at the beginning as policies co-creating vulnerability. So I loved Audrey's contribution or intervention at the beginning, and how she dispelled the myth of resettlement as a long-awaited for solution. So in this regard, I think, Audrey, you have debunked this myth, being as a myth of mobility, moving on, showing us how it's about people, moving under the control of authorities, and how resettlement is actually linked to narratives of containment, disciplining, framing who is a good, deserving, successful refugee, so on and so forth. And you have tightly demonstrated how in this regard, mobility can degenerate into containment and into tools for disciplining refugees. So in that regard, I guess you asked the crucial question whether, such practices at the end, including community sponsorship, so on and so forth, if they in a way alter the meaning or the essence of meaningful refugee protection. And so this reminded me also of a recent critical scholarship that not only looks at the resettlement phase or what happens after resettlement, but also the pre-resettlement phase. Whereas, people endlessly wait, and see their lives being stalled, not knowing what to expect. So I was just wondering how at the same time, it's not only the resettlement path and what happens after, but also the pre-resettlement scenarios through which authorities also coerce migrants and refugees into actually accepting a destiny of endless waiting. And so I wanted to bring in this insight here. So moving on to Natalia Medina's contribution on practices in Brazil, I found, this case study fascinating and also resonating with my research on Middle Eastern states, how, states come up with a spectrum of refugee and migrants tools, trying to actually promote themselves as actors in the international system that are actually, bringing solutions and helping refugees and migrants in a way benefit from some humanitarian solutions, while at the same time diluting refugee status. So I loved very much how you have shown us those tensions that arise between mobility and containment, kind of, in a hybrid or twilight zone, and how border controls and humanitarian assistance coexist through such practices, while at the same time highlighting how they are tools of surveillance and how shelters, at the end of the day, become areas to discipline migrants and better collect data on their profiles. And so this resonated a lot with my own research in Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and Turkey in the wake of Syrian displacement, and how not only state actors but also international actors have actually forged those in-between spaces between border controls and humanitarian assistance to better discipline, migrants and refugees, and fabricate zones of humanitarian governance that are more akin to surveillance, right? So moving on to Fatima, I guess in the same line, also you've demonstrated to us how South Africa has evolved into a rogue actor, while adopting so-called innovative practices. And you've also flagged the short-term benefits of such so-called innovative endeavors, showing us how they take away benefits in the long term and how they dilute refugee protection and empty asylum of its meaning. And last but not least, Louis, it was a great pleasure to listen to you again. So I guess that you've unpacked how proponents and exponents of the Jordan Compact have evaluated this tool, but you've gone way beyond this debate. So I loved how you kind of, in a way, laid out a threefold analytical framework. So first, you invited us to look at the background or geopolitical environment that has shaped the Jordan Compact, the bargain behind the compact, so to say, reminding us of the broader geopolitical and structural conditions that shape these so-called innovative practices, and that we should also keep in mind. And secondly, you looked at mobility questions and how they have strongly shaped the compact's implementation, such as remoteness from the special economic zones, transport questions, gendered questions of mobility. And this also awakened, this kind of metaphor of mobility turning into containment. Because mobility questions actually in this very case have impinged on, refugees' mobility in a way. And thirdly, you've also attracted our interest to how such instruments are embedded within underlying interests related to formality versus informality that are in this case at the heart of the Jordan's historical legacies and Jordan's segmented labor market. So in a way, I guess you've done a great job at showing the complexity of these innovative practices and how, beyond this veneer of innovativeness, actually it's important to unpack intricate complexities and show how they have an uneasy relationship with refugee protection. So just to end my reflection, I just wanted to ask two questions. They are more like reflections. So I guess that this was a terrific panel because it alerted us to the shortcomings of these innovative practices. So you've all alerted us to glorifying innovative practices that fall short of rights-based humanitarianism, But this also reminded me of this fleeting euphoric moment in 2016, you know, with the New York Declaration that inspired, you know, this flurry of literature and practitioners' work on how we should actually come up with innovative practices such as temporary protection, humanitarian visas, private initiatives. You know, that those were framed at the time as pragmatic solutions, given that states are reluctant to guarantee full-fledged legal remedies for refugees. So in my own research, also in the Middle East, you know, I've carried out interviews, for instance, with UNHCR officials, and they have sometimes, you know, framed innovative practices as pragmatic solutions in the sense that, you know, states might be reluctant to uphold refugee status, so these practices are better than nothing. However, so this is an impasse in that regard. How can we go beyond it? You know, because innovative practices are looked at as pragmatic, realistic, you know, in the context of state reluctance. So how do we go from there? And then my last reflection is, you've greatly shown us the limitations of looking at national asylum governance instruments through the lens of mobility and containment. And you've shown us how actually mobility is intricately linked to regulations, extraterritorialization, and exclusionary politics. So I was just like thinking, after carrying out your research, I was wondering what alternative analytical and methodological tools we could use to escape this misleading binary of mobility versus containment when we look at national asylum frameworks. So in a way, how can we analyze national asylum frameworks going beyond the tools of mobility and containment? I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tamiras, and for your insights and sharing also your own research or bringing it back. Indeed, it seems that similar practices are resonating all around or all across. And with this, I would like to invite subsequent discussant, Luisa Felin Freire from Universidad del Pacífico, Lima, and she has co-authored another ASILE forum contribution on lessons from the South with Eliza Brumat, and we would like to hear how these lessons from the South that you have shared are resonating with what you just heard from our panelists. So the floor is yours. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Lina. Thank you all presenters for the excellent presentations, and Tamiras for giving us a summary, again, a critical summary of what we've already heard. So with your permission, Lina, I will take advantage to talk a little bit more about Latin America and the importance of paradigms. So I think sometimes something we hear in all presentations that we have these ad hoc or special or innovative or creative reactions that do not always guarantee protection. And one thing I would like to talk about a little bit more is the importance of ideas and paradigms and how we see refugee protection, but also how we see human mobility a little bit more generally, and this from the Latin American experience. Natalia, you already mentioned two of the most important instruments in the Latin American region, the Cartagena definition of refugee on the one hand side, and the South American, Mercosur Residence Agreement on the other. No? In our contribution with Leiza Brumat, we really focus on these two instruments, which we call the dual protection instrument. Now, of course, it's only the Cartagena refugee definition that really falls under refugee law. And it's very important to point out here that 15 countries in the region have adopted this broader definition in their national legislation. We have a problem in the region with information and consciousness about this fact, because even talking to policy policymakers, they're very often not aware that their own legislation includes this expanded definition that, of course, also is reflected in many African laws. And that's a link I see there with Fatima's presentation and the definition of refugee in South Africa, or the expanded definition. So very often in the region, when we talk about refugee protection and Cartagena, people think about the non-binding Cartagena Declaration. Even policymakers and officials very often are not fully aware that we're talking about their binding national legislation. So that on the one hand side. On the other hand side, Natalia, you also mentioned the Mercosur residence agreement, and I think it's very important to point out that both, not only the Cartagena definition and strictly speaking refugee protection, but the management of human mobility within Latin America has a very different paradigm, has a very different outlook on how human mobility should be managed. And that outlook focuses much more on regularization than on control and exclusion. I think that has different reasons. With LESA, we argue that one reason is that the region does not have common external boundaries and borders, so there's no pressure not to protect that outer border or boundary. But there's also a different factor, and LESA and I are actually working on a different paper on this. There's this real moral counter-positioning, right? And this has been mentioned in the literature or the emerging literature on Latin American immigration, refugee law, and policies. It hasn't been studied that much, but there is evidence that really policymakers made sense of migration management and refugee protection in moral counter-positioning to the United States and to the European Union. And that has real repercussions on the national and on the regional level. So we spoke and we have evidence by national officials, but also if we look at the South American Conference on Migration, there really is this focus on regularization. And that goes in hand with two things. It goes in hand with the human rights focus, but it also goes in hand with the very pragmatic recognition that we cannot control our borders, right? That migration flows, especially humanitarian flows, will continue to occur. Not even the United States, not even the European Union can control their borders. So what can we do? This recognition, this pragmatic recognition, is crucial, because once policymakers recognize that, then the only reasonable and logic next step is regularization and protection, both for the benefit of migrants and refugees themselves, but also for the hosting communities. And I think, and I'm a hopeless optimist, and I will also mention some more negative developments like in a little bit, but I think in South America in the past 2 decades, there really has been progress in terms of this paradigm shift in the way that policymakers and officials made sense of human mobility. And I think it is very, very important. And we see that especially on the level of foreign ministries, migration departments, so more in the bureaucracies across the region. That paradigm is there. It has coexisted with the securitization paradigm. And I think, Natalia, you made that very clear. And there is a battle between those two paradigms, but it is there. And I think we need to think about how to foster that. And that would be my main question. And how can we diffuse that from the South to other regions, right? The problem is that at the same time, migration and refugee policies are politics. And as many of you are aware, we are facing the second largest displacement crisis in the region right now. Very briefly, because I'm already running out of time, but Latin American and South American countries especially have received and are hosting over 5.4 million Venezuelan citizens. That is, not just to put it in perspective, compared to an overall population in South America alone of 430 million, very comparable to the European population, and having accepted only 1.5 million Syrians in 2015. So the initial reactions, very, very briefly, were very positive, very welcoming, very generous, but implementing a lot of these ad hoc protection mechanisms or visas or work visas, which gave some sort of legal status and protection, but usually that was unsustainable and limited in time in many countries. Only Brazil has applied Cartagena, and Mexico and Central America. What we're seeing more recently are two things, and that's why I'm talking about the struggle of these two paradigms and how they play out on the political level. We, of course, have the example of Colombia, and I need to mention it. Colombia very recently has decided to give temporary protection to all Venezuelans in the territory that is hosting. So over 1.8 million people will receive temporary regular status for 10 years. And it has further implemented, so it's not only a regularization program, it is also a mechanism for all those who will enter legally in the next 2 years. Of course, from a civil society or academic perspective, there are always drawbacks. In order to enter regularly, you need a passport. And if you're not rich in Venezuela right now, you don't have a passport. So that mechanism is very limited in a way, but it is an extremely generous decision. It is also an extremely pragmatic decision because Colombia knows that it cannot control its borders and that by regularizing, it can, that's the only way of gaining control over this population, and also the only way to attract international cooperation to manage this flow and to invest in public policy and public services for all. On the other hand, and there I'll end because I know I'm running out of time, we see other countries such as Ecuador, Peru, and Chile that have militarized their borders. Ecuador and Peru, we're in the middle of presidential campaigns. Unfortunately, we're seeing the same discourses that many of you in the global north are just too familiar with. We did a media analysis for ACNUR, for UNHCR, up until end of last year. The media did not speak about illegals in Peru. With the militarization of the border and the presidential campaign, suddenly we have an invasion by illegals. Suddenly we have illegals who not only bring crime, but of course also COVID, which is just ridiculous. So I'll end here. I think there is hope, and I think there are lessons to be learned both in legal terms, so the extension of socioeconomic rights to migrants and refugees, irrespective of their status. There's this lesson to learn in terms of how we approach the matter. But of course, there are also other more negative developments. And I think what we should think about together is how we can foster those positive developments. And I think we need to think about ideas and paradigms, because how we frame these issues and how policymakers and politicians, officials frame these issues will have very real effects in policies and in lives of migrants and refugees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luisa, for your optimism, first of all, and for encouraging those consideration of those truly positive practices and the way they can be implemented, and also, unfortunately, also recognizing that there is some kind of worst practice learning, especially among narratives among the politicians and some policymakers who are trying to find loopholes in order not to do what the Global Compact or New York Declaration agreed to do by delineating the two types of categories of migrants and refugees. And with this, we move to Adèle Garnier, who also who is from Quebec, so also has a Canadian perspective, but in her contribution to ASILE Forum, she has been also engaging in comparing Australian and Canadian models. So what about those policies of non-arrival of those countries that are seen as destination countries? And we would like to hear from you also reflection on this panel's discussion.
Thank you very much, Lina, and I'm very grateful for the invitation and the fantastic presentations and commentary so far. Maybe I'm going to start with the refugee resettlement issue that Audrey mentioned, also because that's what my focused on, and then I'll move on a little bit to perhaps putting my comments in a broader historical lens as well. What I wanted to start on, which is very interesting with resettlement, is it's a discretionary instrument, and the best with discretion is it's actually a lot of flexibility and responsiveness so to extend schemes that would not exist previously. So, but it seems that we are at a time where the emphasis is more on selectiveness in a general context of restrictionism or selectiveness in terms of migration policies, and economically in the context of neoliberalism as well, where we focus more and more on the private sector to shoulder contributions or even a response to what is perceived as to be a burden. And I think this is the danger of resettlement, and seeing this as a leadership contributions of some countries should not lead us to ignore the forest for the trees. And I think in the Canadian context, it's less pronounced than in the Australian context. So what we have in Australia, and that's where I was based before I was based in Quebec, is that resettlement there is very much used as an alternative to asylum, really to say that we welcome the good refugee that come through a management system, through an orderly system. So there is also, we need to be careful with this focus on orderly migration, because Australia has very much instrumentalized the orderliness to delegitimize the claiming of asylum by people who use their own agency to cross borders. And what Australia has done is to say, well, we are looking for people who wait patiently in the queue, and the other are the queue jumpers. So this is a vocabulary that is accepted in Australia by the population, by parties on both sides of the political spectrum, basically. There's a consensus there. And they legitimize the exterritorialization of asylum processing to other countries in the Australian context. Even though actually their settlement contribution has never been the first in the world, and they are even below some European contributors to resettlement now. In the Canadian case, as Audrey said, this is less pronounced, but even in Canada, Canada has tried to present itself, has framed itself as a leader on the global refugee, the GCR, the Global Compact for Refugees, as far as the dissemination of private sponsorship and community sponsorship is concerned, but has not profiled itself as a leader on asylum issues. But we do know that in Canada, Canada has what is called the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States, which means that you cannot make an asylum claim in Canada if you have made an asylum claim in the United States before. And the only way for you, if you want to make an asylum claim crossing the US border, is to do so between official border crossing points. And that's how a number of asylum seekers came to Canada in the last few years through an unofficial border crossing points with the border of Quebec. So there was a very Quebecois dimension to this issue. And this is not something that Canada has provided itself as a leader on the international scene. So I think this is important to emphasize also, because in terms of dissemination, the STCA agreement between the US and Canada was in part copied from the Dublin Agreement in Europe with the safe third countries, mutual recognition of other European Union members of safe third countries. And Audrey is mentioning this at length in a great fiche on the ASILE project website that I encourage you to read. So the selectiveness aspect is also important in the other complementary pathways that Canada is emphasizing and where we should be careful. For instance, I think it's a great initiative that Canada is pushing for the resettlement of student refugees through its contribution that it has done for decades. At the same time, these are skilled refugees that are perceived to be a positive cultural, social, and economic contribution to societies. So we have to be very careful there. And again, even this scheme is a discretionary scheme. And in the Canadian context, Quebec, for instance, is itself responsible for the private, for refugee resettlement. And last year imposed a ban on private sponsorship and on university resettlement for a year, alleging that there was fraud in the program. And so that's not something that is probably well known outside of the borders of Quebec, really. But this is just to say that even in Canada, you can have this sort of stop and go with resettlement, even in one of its considered one of the most politically welcoming contexts in the global north towards refugees. So that would be my point regarding Canada, Australia, and the caution that we have to have in regards to resettlement. And now briefly on the greater historical lens, and then my final point that is going to be bureaucratic complexity and informality. So we have to be very, I mean, I was very, very pleased to hear from Fatima and Natalia about the initiative that have been put in place in Latin America, and this has a veneer of innovativeness, and I think it is very important to provide some rights to some refugees that don't have rights. But if these schemes actually reduce the rights of all the refugees in the long term, then this is a big problem. Historically, there have been these initiatives over time. So this is not the first time that innovative schemes are being put in place, but we always have to be very careful about the local, national, international political context in which these initiatives are being deployed. Because, for instance, we tend to say, oh, the aftermath of the Second World War was a spike in refugee resettlement and compassion, when we know this was also because it was in the context of the Cold War. So the most refugees that were resettled in the world they were perceived as geopolitical gains and as economic gains for settler societies. What kind of discourse can we replace this with now? So this is a big problem. The other thing is asylum, and this is also putting it in the historical context. The rise of asylum is also a focus on the rights of refugees in the context of the convention and all the other treaties. So how don't we replace rights with compassion? That's another problem with resettlement. It's this of compassion. How we do actually emphasize rights-based claim for asylum and then citizenship and political agency of the people. How do we do this? And my last point, also in response to all the panelists and discussants, is really this issue of we are creating, this innovativeness is perhaps not new in the political sense, but we are creating layers and layers of new bureaucratic avenue and a new bureaucratic complexity in migration and resettlement systems. And to mention just one, so Canada just established a scheme of permanent residency for essential workers with precarious status in Canada that were in the asylum system. So it's sort of a new complementary pathways for people who worked in the health system. And it took months and months and months of bureaucratic changes to create new status for these people, because the system is so complicated that even if you say, oh, we are creating this new system, you shift an entire bureaucracy that is becoming more and more complex. And so my question would also be, how do we actually make the system work if it is getting more and more complicated? And to quote James C. Scott, everyone wants to look like a state. How do we make the schemes more and more accessible in this context? I think it's a big question for us academics and practitioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adele, for highlighting also the very practical or administrative side of the issue, and how, increasing innovation can actually lead to some bureaucratic stagnation, because it's getting so complex. And now we are bringing the lessons from the global south and far in the north, and towards back to Europe, and Jens Vested Hansen, who is also very much in the leading role of ASILE's overall framing of containment and mobility. We would like to hear from you. How do you see those lessons resonating with what's happening in the EU, and what are the synergies, and how we could inject maybe a bit more optimism that Luisa was calling for. So Jens, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lina. I cannot promise to inject optimism, and maybe despite my legal background, I cannot even inject pure trust in legal principles. In fact, my intervention will present some observations on the status or the impact of the rule of law in asylum governance, and it is in one way disconnected from the common European asylum system, in the sense that in Europe, of course, we love to think of ourselves as basing everything on the rule of law, which was sort of one of the essentials of the Council of Europe, established in 1949. But in fact, when considering the various asylum governance systems that have been described in the country fishes, and also comparing with the presentations we heard from the excellent speakers this afternoon, it has struck me that there is not a very simple relationship between rule of law and asylum governance. In fact, if we look at the containment mobility dichotomy that Sergio introduced so clearly in the light of the objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees. I think it is clear that there is a quite complex relationship between the objectives of easing pressure on host countries and enhancing refugee self-reliance, and perhaps even expanding access to third country solutions. If we consider mobility, or as Sergio suggested, contained mobility, I think it is important to be aware that mobility in fact has two different aspects, one internal in the host country and one external. I think that many of the issues pertaining to pressure on host countries and refugee self-reliance are in a complex manner linked to issues of internal mobility or containment. It is described very clearly in some of the country fishes that in certain host countries, in particular maybe Bangladesh, but also in practice Jordan, I guess to some extent at least, and perhaps even Turkey, the internal freedom of movement of refugees has been quite significantly limited. From a legal perspective, that may raise questions as to the Refugee Convention, in which Article 26 actually provides quite some protection of refugees' freedom of movement, and it also raises issues of general human rights treaty protection. This is, of course, in particular problematic when it comes to encampment of refugees. And in fact, the internal aspect or dimension of mobility is also linked to the socioeconomic rights, in the sense that refugees' self-reliance depends on the possibility to access the labor market or take up self-employment. And even socioeconomic rights, such as the right to education, will also depend on some degree of internal free movement rights for refugees. Therefore, I think that we will see in practice an interdependence, as is also stipulated in the Global Compact, between these objectives of easing pressure on host countries and enhancing refugee self-reliance, and on the other hand, their exercise of fundamental refugee and human rights. And this altogether also raises issues of the rule of law, because as it was made very clear in Fatima Khan's presentation on South Africa, even a system like the South African, which sort of on surface provides free movement rights and even has pledged to enhance also the delivery of the documentation for refugees, even there seems to be problems with access to actual self-reliance work and so on. And this is, of course, most clearly illustrated also perhaps by what Louis said on the Jordan Compact, where he very interestingly sort of pointed to the complexities of going for formal or informal arrangements. Perhaps informality or ambiguity can de facto deliver as effective refugee protection as more formal entitlements. In any event, I think it leaves us with a quite complex situation of asylum governance systems and principles here, because also the internal aspect of mobility has links also to the external aspect, in the sense that if there is a lack of internal mobility leading to self-reliance, that may in turn imply also not only increased burdens on the host country or on the international donor community, It may also result in a push towards external mobility. So therefore, we again see this, these issues of rule of law in asylum governance as also very much linked to the effectiveness of containment in the external aspect of mobility containment questions. I think I'll have to leave it there in order to allow some time for the discussion. So these were just my observations on rule of law and asylum governance, as illustrated very well by the some of the country fishes as well as the presentations from previous speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jens. And we are moving back to the panel now to react to the discussants' comments. And before moving to Professor Audrey, we also would like to raise the question from Patricia Ramos Barros, who asked, who would like to know professor's opinion or hypothesis about the consequences of the prevalence of a private sponsorship model in terms of protection of refugee rights, and which are benefits for the state in a way of avoiding broader responsibility on resettlement of asylum seekers. And we just give each of you 2-3 minutes to kind of impossible time to respond to what has been said, but please pick your most important points you would like to react. Dear Audrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to each of the commentators for really wonderful, thought-provoking comments and questions, and to all of the other panelists whose presentations I thoroughly enjoyed and learned a lot from. I will begin by responding to the question about the impact of so-called privatization on refugee rights, and just say Adele's points with respect to Australia are extremely important and well taken. I will confine my comments to Canada, which she also commented on and is certainly an expert in. I would say now is my chance to say some positive things, I suppose, about private sponsorship. And that is that when people are resettled to Canada, whether publicly or privately, they are immediately given permanent resident status. And so they do enjoy full rights protection as permanent residents as with any other permanent resident of Canada. After the 1-year period of sponsorship ends, whether it's government assisted or private sponsorship, they are eligible, for example, for income assistance in the same way that anybody else would be. It's also an overstatement, which I'll now nuance, to talk about private sponsorship as if the state bears no responsibility or involvement. It would make much more sense to actually talk about private sponsorship, at least in Canada, as something more like a public-private partnership, because language training, healthcare, education, a whole range of services are still provided publicly, even under a private sponsorship model. So there's much more to say about that, but I'll just leave it at that. The other point I wanted to make in response to the comments, and I'll try to be brief, picks up on Jens' really excellent attention to the rule of law here. And I want to say it is my view, after thinking about this for a long time, I guess, that asylum seekers, non-citizens as such, are always very tenuously protected by the rule of law, in my view. And why is that is the question. And my belief is that however much they are technically protected by law, for example, protection against non-refoulement under the convention is a legal right, right? It doesn't matter. They bump up against a deep conviction that sovereignty gives states discretion to decide who enters on what terms for how long and so on. And there's a continual tension between this deep commitment of state sovereignty as choice, as complete border control, and whatever actual legal protections refugees might enjoy. And so, for example, Temiras rightly pointed out to the ways in which refugees awaiting resettlement are treated. They are treated as if they are not really subjects of the rule of law. They are mere objects to be managed. They aren't entitled to procedural fairness in the determination of refugee claims. They are left in limbo indefinitely. And ironically, although in the global north, they are contrasted as the deserving subjects of refugee protection. Within what I understand to be the actual resettlement regimes in the Global South, they are often regarded with the same culture of suspicion that attaches to asylum seekers in the Global North. When we talk about discretion and these programs, right, again, you see the proliferation of discretionary complementary pathway programs that may appear to provide more benefits sometimes than refugee protection does. But the danger is they're invariably contingent, they're time dependent, and they're discretionary. And so what that means is that people are put in the invidious situation of choosing, if you want to use the language of choice, between something temporary, potentially ephemeral, but that seems to dangle something positive in front of them that they don't get in the endless wait for refugee determination, but it can disappear at any moment. Whereas the illusion or the belief or the faith in refugee protection as a legal obligation is dangling out there as a hope. I think that the ways in which refugees, non-citizens even, are not regarded as full subjects of the rule of law helps, I think, explain increasing complexity, the precarity, the contingency that we're talking about in many of these regimes. And last thing I'll say is that it has also given me, perhaps we haven't talked about COVID, kind of ducking that, but to say COVID has made me wonder about what we mean when we talk about mobility. Because mobility can't just be that people move, right? Because people are moved, that doesn't make them mobile. And we have seen now the limits within countries on people's capacity to move. And so I think one of the things we need to do is start thinking more about what do we really mean by mobility? Because the more it's constrained, the more we start to think, well, what does it mean to be able to move? Is it nothing more than being given permission to move? And if mobility is nothing more than permission to move, that's a very different concept of mobility than the one that we have all imagined ourselves to be working with all this time. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and we'll give permission to move towards Natalia to further elaborate on the issues that have been raised regarding her intervention, and also adding one more question we received here from Abdullah LB, who also asked a bit more from EU perspective on this in the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. Eurodac is very much also posed or presented as also a tool for criminal justice systems, and kind of bringing together and creating this immigration regime that I'm sure you can resonate. And the question is how one can ensure the protection of the tool, but also to ensure that also to promote security that is inevitable in this interoperability systems, or that governments are saying that they want to promote security by getting access to those asylum databases and cross-checking them against criminal databases. So Natalia, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you very much for all the comments. I also have learned a lot during this panel today, and I think I will address especially Luisa's Freire questions, which were more specific about Brazil. Yeah, and she brings some very valid points about these trends that are Latin American Latin American expression about what this subcontinent thinks and acts and promises in terms of idea and paradigms. And I think it's a very, very interesting question. So it's this optimism, I think, is very welcome in the sense that, of course, there are some instruments and some qualities that are trends in Latin America, and that are not the case in the European Union. So there are good experiences here, and I agree with her when when she talks about this pragmatic view and this progressive focus. Yeah. But on the other hand, I guess the contemporary times do not allow us to be so optimistic, because it is very clear now that with COVID-19 pandemic, this precarious protection provided for in humanitarian visa, for example, there shows that there is a lack of protection for those who really are not just people who are in mobility, who are migrants, but who are deserving of special protection and human rights. And these trends in Latin America, they have to do also with a past linked with military dictatorships and not so complete transition to democracy. And I think that this is present in our systems. And in Brazil, the new migration law of 2017 is a very good example of that, because this law has been made after so much of democratic work and national conference, and it's really a beautiful piece. But then it suffers so much vetoes, and even the concept of migrant, which was human rights based, was vetoed. So the first article of the law was vetoed because it brought a concept of migrant that was not based on some prejudicial view about migration. And then it has been very difficult to put the law in practice, and it has suffered so many constraints since it was edited in 2017. So I think that this trend of an incomplete transition to democracy is also shared among several Latin America countries, and it makes protection fragile, precarious, in the sense that, yes, regularization is important, and we of course need it. But on the other hand, once there is a pandemic, and we know that migrants' rights are the first one to be eluded, and we have, we have recognized that even with the expanded definition that we have used to recognize Venezuelans as refugees, then there are political considerations that are mobilized to block these people on the frontier. So in Brazil, we have had, since the beginning of the pandemic, the addition of decrees that have closed borders, and they are specifically directed to persons from the Venezuelan nationality. So I guess from one point of view, of course, there are many promising instruments, and the humanitarian visa is one of those, as well as the expanded definition. But on the other hand, these instruments, they are extremely fragile to political considerations. And that is being made quite clear in the Haitian situation, the Haitian migrant situation in Brazil, because they were not recognized as refugees, even though we have an expanded definition. And that is because some people elaborate on this, that maybe that was because Brazil had a participation in the peace forces in Haiti. So it would be not very, it would not be politically adequate to say, okay, so there is really a situation that deserves the refugee status protection. And on the other hand, on Venezuelan situation, we see that it is also there are lots of political issues and democratic connodules that are coming together So in the way that Brazil deals with these migrants and refugees. So I think that
Thank you.
the fragility and contingent aspects of these instruments are to be emphasized. I'm sorry, I talked too much.
Thank you for putting in this political context, and I think this resonates a lot to what Adele has been highlighting. Who, depending, coming from where, and with this, let's move to Fatima. And what has been the key issues you would like to highlight in this closing 2-minute speech? Please unmute yourself.
Unmute. Thank you, Lena, and thank you very much to the discussant. That was really excellent feedback from the discussants. So thank you very much for that. I just have 2 or maybe 3 points to make. And even though, like Audrey, I started off being critical and cautious about the approaches, I would like to say that we should not discount the benefits of complementary pathways, whether they are refugee-specific or non-refugee specific, as long as there are elements in place in these complementary pathways. You know, as long as there's a continued respect for human rights, and if it doesn't take away any of the rights of refugees or asylum seekers that's already been awarded. And I think in this day and age, if it is within the ethos of the GCR, because the GCR calls for pragmatic solutions, but for the GCR, let me just share this on the GCR. The GCR in my region, there has been very little sharing of the GCR with civil rights movements and with the public in general. The state knows about the GCR, but it hasn't really filtered down to civil society. And I do believe that the UNHCR has a huge role to play. You know, it needs to be, for it to have meaning, it needs to be introduced to society and to private actors and other stakeholders besides states in a far more efficient manner that it has currently been introduced to civil society. And the last point perhaps I want to make is on the issue of mixed migration. I believe it is a narrative that was introduced by UNHCR a few years ago, or maybe about 10 years ago, or longer, and it is a narrative that was embraced by the South African government to the detriment of refugees and asylums. So that's my contribution. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And we are moving to Luis now, Turner, who also can now has to answer to his provocation because on informality, because it was also picked up by our attendees who questioned how this informality can be of advantage. So maybe you can elaborate on that and any other points you would like to highlight.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you again, everyone. It's been a really rich discussion and yeah, very thought-provoking. So there was a question in the chat in the Q&A, which I did type an answer to, but I'll mention briefly, was about what about the kinds of jobs that can only be accessed formally, which is a very important point to raise. And in that typed answer, I said I was speaking to a context in which, in fact, those jobs are legally unavailable to refugees, in fact, to non-Jordanians. A wide swathe of professional occupations, as people might call them, are legally reserved for Jordanians. So in the context of refugees and asylum seekers and their work in Jordan, the vast majority of it is in sectors such as agriculture and construction. And on that point about sort of the benefits of formality and informality, I just wanted to raise also in response to some comments in the chat that I didn't mean to underemphasize or to play down the importance of Syrians being protected from legal punishment or deportation or removal as a result of working without a permit. That is, of course, absolutely an incredibly important protection. I think the point I was trying to raise was that it's about, I suppose, the suitability of the instruments to tackle a problem. Indeed, of course, all the Syrians who have been deported are overwhelmingly already in Jordan legally, and the government could simply choose to give them all the right to work. But the focus went into work permits, in part because they were meant to do this whole series of other things as well. They were meant to improve wages, meant to improve job security, expected to sort of equalize conditions between Jordanians and Syrians in the workforce, and they seem on the whole not to have done that. There are so many points that it would be great to talk to more, but I'll just respond to, or try and respond to one. But thank you to all the discussants. But I was quite struck by Adele's question, which, at least as I noted down in my notes, quickly writing, said, how do we make this all work? Or how do we make these things work? Which is, of course, the key question, right? And I think one of the things that I've been struck by is the extent to which policies are implemented because they are the right ones to tackle the problem, or if policies are implemented because there exists an area in which something can be done. So, for example, a lot of the sort of livelihoods interventions in Jordan are focused around training Syrians and giving them a huge number of workshops and trainings and skill sessions that actually people sometimes attend, 5, 10, 20 and don't get a job at the end. And the reason they don't get a job at the end is a structural constraint of the labour market in large part, because of what jobs are available and who gets employed for them. As Tamaras mentioned, the nationally segmented labour market in Jordan is a really important context. And so I think that your question, Adele, about how do we make these things work made me think of that example, because it made me think about, well, a lot of things are not working, in part because they're the wrong tools or the wrong instruments, but a lot of the fundamental problems are perhaps not subject to the actors we're talking about to be able to solve, such as the structural informality or insecurity or precarity of a labour market. And I think the question of what do we do then is a difficult one, to which I certainly do not have an answer. But thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. And if any of the discussants would like to make very brief final point, you're welcome. No, I see shaking heads. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone. I think we just on time. We started 5 minutes later, so we are just on time to finish it. And thank you for your very much thought-provoking interventions, showing how different the contexts are. However, how many similarities there are in terms of this mobility and containment practices, and even some of seemingly rights advancing practices not fully being integrated, as since highlighted in this rule of law full approach, and then how much it depends again on the wider politics and taking this learning back to the EU, where we also heard the terms like queue jumping, especially when it came to Brexit debate and discussions in Britain, and I think now also in Denmark, new initiatives that are very stringent. How much of those learnings have been cross-fertilizing and feeding into each other. So I think this is the topic that we will continue to discuss. And also I would like to thank you for highlighting, on this very notion of mobility and what's the role of migrants or refugees agency, and how governments are just attempting to differentiate between those two categories when it seems it's sometimes really hard to make those distinctions. So we are very much looking forward to future discussions, and actually in light of Fatima's also notion that that around JCR there was not so much of civil society engagement, while we saw on the other hand on Global Compact on Migration there was very big mobilization of civil society pushing this agenda forward and very vocally mobilizing around that. And why is that? And I think we'll continue with also ASILE civil society group and the discussion and upcoming forum contributions also, which will take a bit closer and maybe critical look into this partnership principle. That's for the future, but we would like to invite you all to continue the debate and discussion tomorrow that will start at 11 Brussels time, and we'll start with some policy panel bringing back or looking closer into the EU Migration and Asylum Pact and how EU is situating itself in this global realm, whether it's being trendsetter or the follower of pre-existing trends that have been set maybe somewhere in Canada or Australia or elsewhere. So thank you so much. It has been fascinating, and we invite you to continue discussion online, and see you tomorrow. And thanks once again for our attendees. Thanks for the speakers for their excellent contributions to the discussants, for their points highlighted. I think we can make yet another forum discussion contributions based on what has been just exchanged here. And as I just mentioned, for all the attendees, thank you for your questions, and we are very much looking forward to continued discussion tomorrow. And also welcome to tweet, retweet, engage with the ASILE project Twitter